Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Terra Esquivel board members. I'm Crystal Moreno, the Program Manager for Traditional Ecological Knowledge for the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. We thank you for accommodating us today and providing the space for tribal perspective and response. As you heard earlier from our tribal engagement panel, there is no sufficient substitute for direct tribal involvement in these crucial interactions. If outcomes are to address tribal concerns, then tribal engagement with sovereign tribal nations is necessary. This includes discussions on tribal beneficial uses, which I would like to address today. We are well aware that the Water Board previously punted the designation and implementation of TBUs to the regional boards. The regional board staff is lovely. We like working with them. However, to plainly state it, the process is not working. The regional board process has lacked guidance from the state board, has had no clear timeframe for designations or implementation, lacks consistency, and has shown us that TBUs simply have not been prioritized. Meanwhile, tribal communities remain at risk for elevated levels of exposure to toxins throughout the watershed. We're disappointed that the draft staff report to the Bay Delta Plan did not contain a firm recommendation to include TBUs in the plan. After several conversations with the board and staff prior to the draft report's release, we view this as another missed opportunity to turn words into actionable items. The various ways that tribes utilize the waterways is specific and unique, whether it's ceremonial, traditional food sources, or for a myriad of cultural uses. Poor water quality should not be an impediment to continuing our cultural and spiritual practices and lifeways. As Indigenous people, we have a responsibility to pass down our Indigenous knowledge to the next generation and to ensure our cultures are protected and preserved. If TBUs and the water quality standards we need to protect them are not designated and implemented, then we are essentially risking cultural genocide. There have already been instances where we have not been able to practice cultural activities due to poor water quality and toxins, such as HABs, high levels of E. coli, and other contaminants. This has prevented us from gathering our plants, teaching our youth traditional fishing, and even simply getting in the water to cleanse ourselves after certain cultural practices and ceremony. We call upon the Water Board to act expeditiously so our tribal beneficial uses and tribal communities are adequately protected, just as other mainstream designated beneficial uses have been. Additionally, and most importantly, the state board and regional boards should not create an unrealistic, unattainable, inequitable process for TBU designations and protections that essentially would put the burden on tribes to monitor each diversion or discharge permit submitted to you to ensure TBUs are protected. It is your job, just as it is with any other beneficial use, to know and to learn which water bodies are TBU designated and then move to appropriately uphold the water quality standards required to protect us. The Water Board should not put undue burdens on tribes to prove tribal beneficial uses of waterways, but should accept what tribes feel comfortable sharing. We've been told that what we share through the TBU process, whether at the state or regional board level, is subject to public records requests. So we should not have to disclose sensitive cultural information we don't want revealed. Again, we believe the State Water Resources Control Board should and could designate TBUs in the phase 2 proceedings for the entire watershed, and then move to implement TBUs through ensuing implementation plans and actions the board takes. For example, through adequate temperature and flow management. Beyond phase 2 of the Bay Delta Plan, we urge the board to make tribal beneficial uses a statewide policy. As with other beneficial uses, you do not need the science and data immediately to designate. You can work with tribes to gather the information, to refine the data, and to better understand our various tribal exposure scenarios. Tribes are well positioned to conduct water quality monitoring and to help fill scientific study gaps, such as native plant toxin uptake, fish tissue monitoring, and HABs monitoring. Some of us are already doing this, and others would like to, but simply lack the resources. We need funding that does not restrict us to tribal trust land, but that can be used to test water quality, fish, and plant species throughout our ancestral homelands. You have the authority and the resources to designate TBUs in the Bay Delta Plan, and statewide if you wanted to. What you might be lacking is the political will and maybe a little courage. We're here to help you how we can, because for us, status quo is not an option. We need to protect our tribal communities now, and we need your help to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moreno. Ms. Maloney.
Good morning. My name is Emily Maloney, and I'm the Water Program Coordinator for Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians, a federally recognized tribe with ancestral ties to the Mokelumne River, Lower San Joaquin River, Central and Southern Delta. Thank you for this opportunity to address the board. And I'm here to provide a statement regarding the tribal beneficial uses discussion in Chapter 11. The widespread use of riparian corridors, springs, streams, rivers, and wetlands has been a fact of Native American lifeways within the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta and its tributaries since time immemorial. Despite massive changes in Indigenous lifeways, these practices continue to this day. Long after the Public Land Survey System developed in 1785 to survey, sell, and settle land acquired by the United States, well after the Swamplands Act of 1855 led to the draining of wetlands for conversion to agricultural land in the Delta, cultural practices have continued long after the removal of Indigenous people from their lands, after the creation of reservations, termination of reservations, and restoration of some reservation lands. Tribal cultural uses of water have continued long after the urbanization of watersheds and construction of large-scale dams and water diversion infrastructure and canals. And although tribal cultural uses of water continue today, these uses have been highly altered and modified due to this long history, a steady decline in water quality, and altered hydrology due to the overallocation of water, human hydromodification of water, and climate change. The idea of beneficial uses is a concept that comes from the Clean Water Act, where beneficial uses are the means for identifying goals for various uses of a water body, such as recreation, drinking water, fish, and wildlife. The designations then trigger the creation of water quality objectives or standards to protect the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of waters for those uses. In other words, the state designates waters for a use, sets water quality standards, and then issues discharge permits to limit pollutants to a level that retains adequate water quality. Though Indigenous uses of water have existed since time immemorial, they have not been recognized as a use by the state until recently. And still, we are arguing for their inclusion into your planning documents. The two tribal beneficial use definitions, one being tribal cultural use and the other being tribal subsistence fishing, have recently been approved by your agency and adopted into plans such as the Central Valley Regional Water Board's recent basin plan amendments to the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Tulare Lake basins. However, no designations have been formally made to date. Tribal cultural uses are diverse and cannot be fully expressed here today, but these uses include tangible and intangible elements of water, of ways and relating to the waterways, meaning their value is intrinsically and a particular location may not be used for a physical resource, but for an intangible use, like a prayer or spiritual medicine. Other more physical uses would include the gathering and use of water itself, the gathering of willow, tules, basket sedge, and other aquatic vegetation, the gathering of aquatic fish and wildlife, the use of waterways for a cultural ceremony, a rite of passage, and perhaps a fishing location or a village site. The natural flow regimes inherent to rivers give rise to aquatic plant communities, fish and wildlife that live in these waterways or are dependent on water, directly affect whether a tribal cultural use can be practiced in a good way, meaning there is flow to support the cultural use, that there is a natural flow regime that supports native fish, wildlife, vegetation populations for fishing and gathering purposes, meaning there is safe water quality for tribal immersion, wading or boating for hunting and gathering, ceremonial and other purposes, meaning that there is safe water quality so that the flora and fauna, fish, shellfish, and water itself, when consumed, are not unfit for subsistence level consumption or cultural and ceremonial consumption due to pollutants such as bacteria, bioaccumulation of toxins such as mercury, PFAS, or cyanotoxins. In many instances, flow is the fundamental variable that sets the stage for cultural uses to be properly exercised. You can go back and reference my June 2023 TBU presentation to the board where I talked about this extensively. Today, we have highly modified flow regimes that do not support wild fish populations and instead support invasive and non-native fishes predatory to salmon. We have water infrastructure that has flooded cultural sites and entire tribal villages. Today, we have low flow regimes that lead to harmful algae blooms, and contribute to poor water quality, thus impairing beneficial uses, including undesignated tribal beneficial uses. Flow is crucial for the beneficial use attainment, including TBUs within the Bay Delta watersheds, and the State Water Board is responsible for upholding its duty to protect flow-based tribal beneficial uses. The draft staff report states that it seeks to adopt two tribal beneficial use definitions into the Bay Delta Plan update. Buena Vista Rancheria urges the State Water Board to do its part to protect tribal beneficial uses of water by adopting the two TBU definitions into the plan. Buena Vista also urges the State Water Board to go further and designate waters within the Bay Delta watershed with TBUs where TBUs relate to flow. If TBU designations are not made, as the staff report suggests, then a process must be outlined for how Indigenous community members and tribal governments can assert their TBU and ensure it is protected when there is a water diversion petition, a water right request, a water right transfer or change, or a change in a point of diversion, etc. These processes should also ensure that a water diversion or water right change will not impair the TBU or other beneficial use that is linked to a TBU, such as fish and wildlife. That said, the Bay Delta staff report must create guidance for integrating or linking tribal beneficial uses to other beneficial uses related to flow, such as fish and wildlife, cold, spawn, aquatic life, recreation, municipal. Additionally, because the Bay Delta Plan is intended to overlay and work in conjunction with the Central Valley Regional Water Board's Water Quality Control Plan for the Sacramento, San Joaquin River Basins, and the San Francisco Regional Water Board's Water Quality Control Plan for the San Francisco Bay, the State Water Board must provide guidance to the regional water boards to inform them of their responsibility for upholding water quality for the tribal beneficial uses that occur within their region, whether designated or not. Through, again, linking the tribal beneficial use to a similar pre-existing designated use, such as aquatic life or recreation. However, to be clear, this is not Buena Vista Rancheria's preferred method. Buena Vista Rancheria urges a full designation of tribal beneficial uses for the Bay Delta watershed for flow and water quality by the state and regional water boards, respectively, and expects the state and regional water boards to link flow and water quality in their decision-making processes for water diversion decisions and discharges authorized through the Clean Water Act, Section 402 and PDES permitting procedures. The 2018 Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, Resolution Number 2018-0059, states on page 1, Section 5, that, quote, the State Water Board has authority over both water quality and water diversion and use. On page 1 of Chapter 1 of the 2018 Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan for the San Francisco, Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta Estuary says, quote, the State Water Board's measures to implement this plan will consist of the regulation of existing water rights, regulatory measures to protect water quality, and recommendations to other entities, end quote. Yet, Water Board staff and legal counsel board members continue to state that the Water Board only has authority over water diversions and water rights. Buena Vista Rancheria urges the State Water Board to consider how flows relate to water quality and develop guidance on how flows and water quality relate. In closing, I just want to remind you how pervasive tribal cultural uses are. So please imagine yourself on a body of water, say the Mokelumne River. You're looking at the plants, birds, the water itself. You can hear the sound of the river flowing. You hear the sound of the birds and the plants rustling in the wind. You step into the water and you walk toward a patch of tule, your feet touching the sandy bottom of the river. You give thanks, and with your family and your friends, you gather that tule to make a tule boat for the upcoming tule boat races, say, taking place on Clear Lake. You smile because you think of your buddies who are not with you today, because they're out across the valley in Stone Lakes with their feet in that water, collecting tule for their tule boat that you're going to be racing on Clear Lake. So I have you imagine this because this is what is happening in Indigenous communities throughout the Bay Delta watershed. Collectively, people are using water and the aquatic resources in their area for a similar use. This is a tribal beneficial use, and it's the watershed-wide use, meaning the tribal beneficial uses need to be integrated or designated, need to be protective on a watershed-wide scale and included into the Bay Delta Plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Maloney. Really appreciate those well thought out and constructive feedback and comments. Thank you. Oh, you need to turn on your mic. Thank you.
There we go.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sherry Norris. It's really nice to see all of you guys again. We don't get to see each other often, so it's good to see you and be here. I'm with the California Indian Environmental Alliance, and I echo the sentiments that my colleagues have said. Everything they've said is spot on, and hopefully what I have will supplement. So regarding the Bay Delta Plan update, there's three things that I'm going to talk about. The first has to do with the designation. The second is the voluntary agreements, and the third is just the accessing the materials that we're all reviewing together. The first piece is that in order to set water quality objectives, of course, the responsibility of the water boards and the regional boards is to adopt appropriate designated uses. Tribal beneficial uses were, as you've heard before, the first worst uses of water in the state, and these uses are continuing. And I bring this up to provide a little context. The tribal beneficial uses were left out in the 70s when the other uses were being adopted. At this time, tribes were fighting for basic human rights, the right to vote, their recognition. Many tribes had been terminated. And when we moved through to the Oswego and added the provisions of the tribal beneficial uses, these were created to rectify the oversight. And this was just the beginning, because now, of course, the regional boards are going through their long process, and the tribes haven't been engaged in that process until very recently, and in some regions have not yet been engaged at all. This process is taking much longer than we ever thought it would need to take. And a lot of what's taking so long are the internal conversations that don't include tribes, where the regional board staff are trying to figure out what to do and what this means, but without the tribes at the table to have those conversations with tribes. And this has been going on now for multiple years, and it's way longer than it ever needed to take. So I've strongly encouraged the State Water Board to provide regional water boards with guidance to do this and to help them to move through by having conversations with the tribes to help to move through some of the questions that are before them. So that's the first piece. But I wanted to remind everybody that in order to implement the Clean Water Act, we need all of the available information to be before the regional boards and before all of you. And by going through a process that appears to, in some of the regions, to be different than the process that beneficial uses goes through generally, meaning that generally what happens is the water body is designated with the use, and then you go through the water bodies to find out what those water quality objectives will be. We talk to the users, then we balance all those uses, and come up with a numerical value that's attainable and that's fair given all of the uses on the table. But if tribes are being asked to put forward our objectives, our numerical information first, that's backwards. And it seems like the regional boards are essentially asking for that because they're afraid to acknowledge the use rather than, and then go through the process. They want the numbers first to identify if they're even going to entertain the idea of having tribal beneficial uses on the table. The first use of water in the state. This is backwards, and we're truly asking for the State Water Board to provide guidance to the regional boards. So that guidance is really important. So from there, I'll move into voluntary agreements. So the voluntary agreements are a new idea, and we would need to pilot such a program before locking them in throughout the state. It's premature to look at it, have an 8-year program where we're going to just see what the voluntary agreements do. 8 years will go by, and during that time period, we may lose all of the species that we're trying to protect. We would like to show some success in a region before moving them throughout the state. And in particular, the Bay Delta plan update, it encompasses so many water bodies. It's such a pivotal point. This is not the place to put something new and untried in. The voluntary agreement processes have been exclusionary. They've kept tribes out. It's not been transparent to tribes what's happening. And so for that other reason, I also urge you to not include voluntary agreements in the Bay Delta Plan update at this time. And thirdly, for voluntary agreements, we really need to make sure that we have monitoring in place and some sort of a backstop for the process to start or to end before 8 years goes by. There's not enough protections in there from the regional or state water board in order to move these through. And then lastly, what I wanted to say is that it would be this is a very small thing, but it would be very helpful if the draft that we're trying to review, although I love that we can break it in small parts, some of our computers can't handle big files, it would also be nice to be able to have it in one place so that I could download the whole thing and look for some keywords without having to open up every file. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well, Ms. Norris. I appreciate that. And there should be a consolidated file somewhere, but we'll make sure that it's available on the site if not. And just appreciate all your other very good comment. Next, we'll go to Sarah Ryan. Ms. Ryan, good to see you virtually. Oh, you should be invited to unmute here momentarily. Oh, there we are.
Geez. Thank you. Very good to see you as well. And I'm glad that we could join this important conversation and hearing. My name is Sarah Ryan. I'm the environmental director for the Big Valley Band of Pomo Indians. And our tribe has been working diligently for a number of years alongside other tribes and also the California Indian Environmental Alliance to move the work of tribal beneficial use development forward through both the state process and the regional board process. But I'm here today to comment on the Bay Delta Plan and the staff report that is being developed to protect the water quality of the Bay Delta. On Clear Lake, we've been grateful for the collaboration between agencies who have pulled together for the Clear Lake Hitch or the CHI. The silos that existed between the different agencies, even between the water boards and the regional board, between CDFW, all of these agencies that have a hand in protecting water quality or protecting uses and fish and other life that the tribes and also the general community that they care about. These silos have started to break down, and there has been a tremendous effort to coordinate equipment, monitoring, funding, restoration projects, fish rescues, and other and scientific modeling, and using these things to work together efficiently to do all we can collectively to protect the fisheries. Protected fisheries has a broad positive impact on tribes and the local community. And I'm bringing this up because it sounds like this effort of thinking outside the box and also remembering why we're all here, that this model that has been playing out in Clear Lake for the CHI should happen here. There are multiple players in this conversation. There's the Region 5 and Region 2 basin plans and the water that they send that goes through the Bay Delta that is impaired. You know, the waters of most of the regions, I guess probably all of the regions of California, have some standards, some water quality objectives that they're not meeting, and some beneficial uses that are being impaired. And so to work together with the tribes and the regional boards and the State Water Resources Control Board to really come up with solutions that work for the Bay Delta, I believe is critically important because there's a lot at stake. So I want to talk a little bit about the voluntary agreements and then also just, the kind of the realities of Bay Delta. There's a saying, and I'm just saying this like as a private person, trust Allah, but tether your camel, trust, but verify. voluntary agreements have, there are problems with voluntary agreements. And we believe that if you're going to include those in the plan, that they should be telemetered. You should be using telemetry so that everybody can see what the flow is in those areas. Or just like what we're doing on Clear Lake, you have a coordinated effort where there's flow being monitored by outside entities. We were loaned, the Big Valley Band of Pomo Indians was loaned a flow gauge to monitor flow, measure flow, and we'll be returning that loan because we received some funding from Department of Water Resources to purchase a flow gauge. So that is, a way to verify that voluntary agreements are happening instead of just trusting it's going to happen. The state has a history of trusting private property owners to do the right thing, and I don't think the evidence is really good that they've been that people are doing the best that they can. For example, looking at the water rights reports, the statement of use and diversion, that private property owners who are pulling surface water from a water body, they're supposed to be submitting those to the state every year. Well, we made a very large point of those being inaccurate for the review of the Clear Lake Hitch, and there's since been estimations from water board staff in the enforcement division that over half of the reports that were turned in for Clear Lake watershed use were incorrect and inaccurate, and then the other half weren't even turned in. So my point is that voluntary agreements make it easier for the water boards, but the reality is that many people don't have the time, the training, or even the inclination to be doing the right thing and submitting the information that they're supposed to. So I would suggest that if you're going to use those, to have real actual verification elements in those voluntary agreements. The second is that, when I first learned about the Bay Delta plan, I got concerned because it seems like you're using minimum flow requirements as a proxy to meeting all of the water quality objectives. But because the water is coming from, the two regions, Region 5 and Region 2, there's, and we know that those are impaired waters, there doesn't seem to be a mechanism between how the Delta works with those two regions to ensure improved water quality. We're just stuck in, these very long and ineffective TMDLs. So that means that the water, so as long as you're just doing minimum flow requirements and flow monitoring, it's very, very questionable that the water is actually meeting the water quality objectives of the uses that are there. And so I'm curious, like, what kind of components that this plan has, and moving forward with mitigation measures if the water quality that's coming from Region 5 and Region 2 are not meeting the standards that even their own standards. So what's next? Flow doesn't fix everything, fixes some things. So, ultimately, and just the previous speakers, the other my colleagues did a fantastic job explaining the details of why tribal consultation is so important, and the development of tribal beneficial uses is also so important because we're talking about basically unmonitored waters that are have the potential for affecting the health of individuals. And this is 2023. We're better than that. We need better water quality to be able to continue traditional activities that really require good water quality. So tribal consultation is critical, and it's also critical to be working together to ensure that the water in the Delta meets the water quality standards that are connected to tribal beneficial uses and even just the other uses that exist there. And I'm very interested in working with your staff to understand what exists to ensure that there, as I said, there are mitigation measures in place, and whether that means fewer permits for discharge should be considered so that the water is meeting those standards. I think you should be willing to look at any of those options, because right now there's no compromise. Basically, the short end of the stick is always gotten by the tribes and the environment. So we're better than that, and we need to work harder. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ryan. Really appreciate your continued leadership, certainly in Clear Lake, but on all these issues, and especially around tribal beneficial uses. Thank you. Do we have one more member of this panel, or I have listed here Matthew Moore, that's all. Okay. Well, then just thank you very much. I know, for me, what we certainly have a discussion around is tribal beneficial uses in the context of the Bay Delta Plan, where we're going, and we're here listening. Certainly you saw the staff's first incorporation in the draft staff report around some thinking around that, but I know we'll have a lot more discussion. But just want to note that there is certainly the tribal beneficial use discussion in the context of the Bay Delta Plan, but there is also the larger TBU discussion. I just want to acknowledge and thank. I know Crystal, Moreno, your participation was really appreciated at the Water Quality Coordinating Committee meeting that we had just earlier this year here in October. It was a good discussion. We talked about the first potential designation here, which will be Mono. Lahontan region, the first out the gate, it has taken too long, but what I'm hopeful we can do coming out of that discussion, and here this one as well, is better just synthesize what work we are doing and try to articulate and ensure to engage on the larger project, even as we also kind of dig into what it means in the context of the Bay Delta Plan of how we meaningfully do this. I want to note I wish there were others out there that already had a template that allowed us to pick something up and really start going, but the reality is nowhere else in the nation is this discussion happening at this level with this specificity. So we're all, as usual here, kind of in uncharted territory and discussion. So I appreciate the patience, and I appreciate the engagement around this really critical issue from everyone here. So just a huge thanks. Board Member Firestone.
Thank you. Thanks. And yeah, I agree. I think it was really helpful on the broader, many of these really important points that are super relevant to this Bay Delta Plan are also really important across all of our basin plans. And so I really look forward to starting to do a better job, or to doing a better job of an ongoing conversation with tribes about how we can accelerate that process. And I've seen us already start to have some of that. And I'm confident we will be doing even more of that in the near future overall. So I really appreciate the time and sort of relentless work to try to help us, do justice to what I think is a common intent. And when we adopted this in a SWEB, that we wanted to see beneficial uses protected. And I think despite those intents, it hasn't happened anywhere yet, except for what was done before SWEB in Region 1. And so while we're making important progress, hopefully Mono Lake there is stuff we can do now, and we have to, I think, improve the process and engage with you all and other tribes in figuring out how to do that effectively. But I wanted to talk specifically and ask a question specifically on the Bay Delta Plan, since that's what our workshop's on. This process will be really establishing those objectives and program of implementation for flow, primarily in the Bay Delta Plan. And
And as part of that, what we're going to be doing is weighing what is reasonable protection, right? How do we achieve reasonable protection? It seems to me that it's important for us to understand tribal beneficial uses in order to weigh that reasonable protection and balance, and that balancing that we have to do. But we're also not going to get, I think, as robust a process as we're going to need to ultimately get to in terms of going all the way to establishing objectives for all tribal beneficial use and an implementation plan for all tribal beneficial use protection. So that's not in the scope of what I think this plan is going to do. But we can be setting forward a process and recognizing that this is, it's a basin plan. We do triennial reviews. It's iterative. It seems to me, though, that even if that the real detailed work of what is, exposure, establishing those objectives and really specific programs of implementation that's a lot of work working with tribes and, doing studies, doing monitoring, like you said. That's not going to be totally finished, and it's going to be iterative and living even beyond that. But by the time we need to adopt this plan, but we do need to still understand where there's tribal beneficial uses overall to be able to inform the balancing that we're making now, that we are going to be able to have to make a decision on and take a vote on in the near term. So I guess I'm wondering, is there a pathway that you think is, what I've heard from you is it's important that we build in a process no matter what for this continued work. But I'm also wondering if you see a pathway for us establishing designations that may not be fully complete, for the entire Bay Delta watershed, but would be a start for those that you all have, that you've already started to identify through this process and through consultations. We do have CEQA and planning and other statutory requirements, or we have to identify what are the reasonable potential impacts of our actions. But I'm just wondering if you feel that it's realistic for us to be able to integrate designations of certain beneficial uses within this time frame, including some identification of some of those at a basic high level. I think reasonable expectations of impacts.
Yeah, thank you, Laurel. That was a lot. But we appreciate it because we understand that this is a challenging process. However, the answer can never be to do nothing. Our sense is the designations are needed so that there's weight to them, so that you must balance them. Without the designations, there's not that same weight to it. We think you can designate. We think you can do it on a watershed basis. We don't see any reason why it can't be done in that manner. Because the reality is that tribal communities are suffering, right? So the impacts which you've heard, we can't conduct cultural activities. We can't, conduct ceremony in certain areas. And that is just unacceptable. And so there needs to be a sense of urgency. We need to figure out how we can do designations on a watershed-wide basis. And then, talk about how we fill those scientific study gaps, because we've already identified many, because we have to, because whether or not you all designate, we still have to figure out how we're protecting our communities.
Yeah, I think it is realistic to start at a high level. I mean, waters are impaired right now, uses are impaired right now. Salmon populations are collapsing right now. So if we're waiting, the longer we wait, the longer we lose the ability to practice cultural uses in a good way on these waterways. And, you know, the one thought that comes to mind right now is that you can designate a waterway or you can integrate a TBU on a waterway, and you can do that widespread. Municipal water designations are widespread. You just have to prove otherwise, that they're not, that waterway is not going to be used for a domestic water supply. TBUs need to be done in the same way as a blanket statement. And then we prove otherwise, that that tribal beneficial use is not happening on a particular waterway that is, maybe there's a water right or point of change diversion or something that's going to affect the flow there. But we do need a process outlined. It's a lot of work if there's not a designation for tribes to just be monitoring water quality permits that are before the board, or water right hearings that are before the board, to attend each and every one of those to check and make sure that the TBUs that are not, designated are still not going to be impaired. So that's a lot of work. And so there has to be a process outlined. And that's what we're asking for in this basin plan update, is that a process is outlined.
And then to add to that, that we do have some examples already. For example, in the region 1, where tribal beneficial uses were designated, it was successfully used. And you guys all remember that story about the pesticide that was going to be sprayed upriver from the ceremony that was going to take place. And so by being able to have that beneficial uses on the book, it didn't even have a numerical objective. It was able to be protected. So there's that piece. And then also when it comes to what is subsistence, there's the state definition of subsistence, which happens to be very similar to the meals per week that the Fraser-Schilling study showed. It's 4.5 meals per week. Of course, in the Fraser-Schilling study, it's a mix between salmon and other fish, but there's something there for subsistence already, which does bring me to that ISWIBI, which is where the reason why that happened as a statewide water quality objective goal was because it was for every area, of course, as you remember, that does not have a TMDL. So it was a blanket kind of a moment. And so there's another example of that. Hope that helps. Oh, unless Sarah has anything else to add, I should give her the opportunity.